Welcome to the debate where we delve into substantive issues from multiple expert perspectives. Today, we're navigating the complex and I'd say pretty crucial world of infrastructure and public services, a sector that's, well, constantly seeking innovative financing and delivery models to meet growing global demands. Our core focus today is public-private partnerships, or PPPs as they're commonly known. Now, these are collaborative arrangements where governments team up with private entities. They develop essential infrastructure, deliver public services. Think everything from our roads and railways right through to critical healthcare facilities. They've certainly gained significant global traction, but their true effectiveness in consistently upholding the public interest, well, that remains a profoundly complex and, let's be honest, often contentious issue. So our central question for this debate is this: are public-private partnerships, as currently implemented, an effective and reliable mechanism for prioritizing and achieving the public interest in infrastructure and public service provision? So our central question for this debate is this. Now, I firmly believe that PPPs, when structured thoughtfully and supported by robust governance, are an essential, sometimes even superior tool. They leverage private capital, private expertise to deliver high-quality public services and infrastructure.
And I, on the other hand, will be arguing that despite that theoretical appeal, PPPs frequently fall short in practice, particularly, in contexts where you have institutional vulnerabilities. They often end up compromising the very public interest they supposedly aim to serve.
Okay, a clear difference in perspective there. Before we dive into this critical discussion, just a quick reminder, make sure to subscribe to The Debate channel. You'll find more in-depth analyses on issues impacting the construction world and, frankly, well beyond. All right, to kick us off, let me lay out my position more fully. Public-private partnerships, in my view, are far more than just, an alternative. They are a vital and indeed often superior strategy for modern infrastructure development and public service provision. Governments worldwide facing really tight financial constraints and ever-increasing demands for better services have looked to PPPs. Why? To harness private capital, specialized expertise, and crucially, operational efficiencies. We see this trend across continents. A recent study, for instance, highlighted that a significant, 72% of investment in infrastructure today comes from the private sector. That unequivocally underscores its indispensable role. The fundamental strength of PPPs, I think, lies in their integrated approach. Instead of fragmented processes, you get a single private entity taking responsibility for the entire life cycle, from design, construction, right through to financing, operation, and ongoing maintenance. This creates a really powerful incentive for quality and long-term sustainability right from day one. It's what we often refer to as the private sector having skin in the game. They are motivated, financially motivated, to make optimal decisions up front to avoid costly issues down the line. We've seen this lead to significantly better outcomes than what's often achieved through traditional, sometimes quite fragmented, public procurement. Portugal's journey with PPPs offers a compelling case in point, particularly in its health sector.
Their experience, I believe, demonstrates that administrative centralization of contracts and the establishment of clear, standardized requirements can prepare the public sector to effectively monitor these complex, long-term agreements. This disciplined approach ensures that private objectives, when properly guided and overseen, ultimately align with the public benefit, delivering much-needed infrastructure and services more efficiently and often more effectively.
Okay. Well, while the theoretical promise of public-private partnerships certainly has its allure, I agree with you there. The practical realities, from my perspective, frequently unveil a very different story. It's often one marred by significant risks and, yes, a compromised public interest. The core principle we absolutely must acknowledge is that there is simply no free lunch with PPPs. The costs, whether they're paid upfront or, more often, deferred, are ultimately borne by the taxpayer or the consumer. And here's where the problem often begins. These costs, especially things like contingent liabilities and very long-term financial commitments, are frequently obscured or, let's say, inadequately disclosed. This can create what I call an illusion of affordability. It gives the false impression that a project is somehow off budget or cheaper than it really is, which, can lead to profound fiscal irresponsibility on the part of the public sector. The very nature of PPPs, with their inherently long-term and often, let's face it, incomplete contracts, coupled with pervasive asymmetric information where the private partner just knows more than the public agency, creates fertile ground for opportunistic behavior and inevitable conflicts of interest between the public and private sectors. We've seen vivid illustrations of these challenges in various contexts, and Brazil provides a particularly stark example. Systemic failures in transparency, in monitoring, and in risk allocation in Brazilian PPPs have repeatedly led to, suboptimal project outcomes. For instance, one study I looked at on Brazilian PPPs revealed significant shortcomings in transparency and monitoring practices. This points to a deeper issue, I think. The institutional frameworks in many jurisdictions are often far too weak, too underdeveloped to effectively protect public funds and ensure the promised quality of services. In essence, the risks are often greater, significantly greater, than the touted benefits, particularly for the public purse and the long-term public interest.
That's the strong opening. Certainly highlights the risks. But let's dive into the core of this, because you've highlighted these practical risks. But I would argue the challenge isn't fundamentally the partnership model itself. It's the quality, the robustness of the governance that surrounds it. When institutional frameworks are strong, when they're adaptive, PPPs can be incredibly effective. Portugal's experience, which I mentioned, truly offers a compelling example of this kind of evolution. They've learned from initial challenges and built a highly structured approach, especially visible in their health PPPs. Specifically, they've implemented two distinct managing entities: EGEST, which is Portugal's public entity for clinical service management in these health PPPs, and EGED, the entity responsible for the infrastructure management side. Each has specific contractual provisions, detailed performance indicators, and really clear penalties for noncompliance. We're talking about contracts. They average around 180 pages, supported by, I think it's 31 annexes. That's a meticulous definition of expectations, responsibilities, and desired outcomes. Beyond just the contracts, Portugal established a specialized unit, UTAP, the Technical Support Unit for PPPs, a central oversight body. Now, UTAP has broad responsibilities: monitoring, reporting, even negotiating, ensuring proactive and centralized oversight. This commitment to detailed, integrative governance, and critically, a willingness to learn and adapt legislation over time, that I believe demonstrably aligns private efforts with public health objectives. What Portugal's evolution truly shows is that proactive, adaptive institutional investment in specialized oversight and robust performance-based contracting is the non-negotiable bedrock for transforming PPP risks into reliable public service delivery. It takes work, but it's achievable.
That's an interesting point, and I certainly acknowledge Portugal's efforts to evolve its governance. It's quite impressive in some ways, but my perspective shifts when we consider the inherent power dynamics that are always at play, even with evolving rules. The starting point, and indeed the ongoing reality in many other contexts like Brazil, really highlights the fragility of these governance mechanisms. In Brazil, for example, despite having federal laws intended to provide oversight, the legislative aspects are often described, quite accurately, I think, as rationalist. Now, that's a term denoting frameworks that might look good on paper, strong on theory, but they're weak on the practical, granular detail you actually need. They lack the specificity, the methodological rigor for effective risk assessment or for standardizing contracts in a meaningful way. The contracts themselves, you mentioned Portugal's 180 pages. Well, in Brazil, they average maybe 100 pages and 15 annexes. And they often lean heavily towards prioritizing penalties after something goes wrong, rather than building in genuine incentives for quality and, say, humanization in services, reflecting a reactive rather than a proactive stance. And to make matters worse, Brazil's transparency and accountability practices are frequently categorized as just survival. Now, what this means is disclosure barely meets the minimal legal requirements. It certainly doesn't offer interactive channels for citizens or, crucially, comprehensive independent audit reports. This creates a significant democratic deficit. This isn't merely about, early stage imperfections or a learning curve that every country goes through. It's about a fundamental failure of governance to overcome profound asymmetric information, and, let's be blunt, deeply imbibed political influence. These issues, in turn, hinder rather than help the public interest. It suggests that a lack of truly interactive, comprehensive public disclosure in PPPs isn't just a transparency issue. It creates a systemic democratic deficit where public trust and genuine accountability are continuously undermined.
Look, I'm just not convinced that the existence of challenges, particularly in developing institutional contexts like Brazil, invalidates the PPP model itself. In fact, I'd argue it underscores the critical need for continuous improvement and learning, which is exactly what we've seen in Portugal, as I keep saying. Their experience shows that even when they had initial difficulties, say in defining evaluation criteria, subsequent legislative updates and the creation of these dedicated bodies like UTAP have allowed them to centralize data, enhance reporting, and build real expert technical capacity. This proactive adaptation, this willingness to fix things, demonstrates that robust governance is achievable and it can course-correct initial deficiencies, ultimately strengthening the public interest safeguards within PPPs. Furthermore, we see similar successful adaptations in other places, countries like Australia, like Canada, where robust frameworks have matured over many years. This indicates that the learning process, while, yes, definitely challenging, is a viable path forward for the model. It's proof of concept, really.
That's a compelling argument about adaptability, I grant you that. But have you considered that the sheer complexity and the multi-decade nature, we're talking 20, 30 years sometimes, of these contracts make true, consistent public interest protection exceptionally difficult, even with evolving governance? The inherent vulnerability to political influence, especially over multiple electoral mandates, means that the initial intent, the initial deal, can be easily compromised down the line. For instance, Brazil's PPP units, as you know, often have quite limited autonomy. Their role in fiscal oversight can be rather superficial. They struggle to effectively challenge powerful private partners or ensure strict contract adherence over the long haul. Furthermore, the lack of a unified data structure in Brazil for PPPs, just basic things like collecting comparable data across projects, impedes comprehensive monitoring and makes it really hard to identify and share best practices. This institutional weakness, where the formal structures often aren't sufficient to eliminate persistent issues like conflicts of interest during negotiation or opportunistic behavior later on, suggests that PPPs, as currently structured in many places, are inherently more susceptible to private interest dominating over public ones, regardless of the theoretical governance mechanisms put in place on paper. It's about enduring political and institutional realities, not just a temporary learning curve we can easily overcome. Even with the best intentions, these long-term deals are just incredibly hard to manage purely for the public good.
Okay, so if robust governance is one side of the coin, the other is undoubtedly ensuring that we're getting genuine value for money, VFM. This concept is absolutely fundamental to PPPs. It's about ensuring that a project delivers a greater net positive gain for society compared to sticking with traditional public sector approaches. And this isn't just about shaving off a few percentage points on initial construction costs. It's about achieving holistic efficiencies across the board: construction, operations, maintenance, alongside improved quality and, very often, more timely delivery. When private firms are responsible for the entire lifecycle, from the design board right through to operating the facility years later, they are inherently incentivized, it's in their financial interest, to build quality from the outset to minimize future maintenance costs. Portugal's contracts, for example, are what they explicitly call performance contracts. This means remuneration, the payments they receive, is directly tied to predefined outputs and pretty stringent quality standards, with clear deductions, real financial penalties for failures. This rigorous approach, coupled with a mandatory comparative analysis against public sector comparators, the PSC, ensures that PPPs are only undertaken when they unequivocally offer superior value. It's not automatic. This drives efficiency and innovation that ultimately benefits the public purse and, more importantly, public services. It's about more than just the lowest bid. It's about securing the best long-term outcome.
What this pursuit of value for money truly highlights, I believe, is that PPPs, at their best, transform public procurement from a potentially short-sighted, cost-driven transaction into a long-term performance-driven investment, incentivizing quality and efficiency across the entire project lifecycle.
Hold on, I'm sorry, but I just have to push back strongly on that. The pursuit of value for money, or VFM in PPPs, is, in practice, frequently undermined by a profound lack of transparency and this illusion of affordability I mentioned earlier. The actual costs, the true long-term burden, are often masked by clever accounting, like delaying the recognition of financial liabilities on public balance sheets. This gives the distinct impression of an upfront free lunch, when in reality, future taxpayers are the ones footing a very large bill. Both Brazil and Portugal, especially in their early stages, struggled significantly with developing clear, reliable VFM methodologies. They often lacked detailed frameworks for comprehensive economic analysis, for assessing fiscal accessibility, can the government actually afford this long-term, or for standardized risk identification and allocation. This makes it incredibly challenging, sometimes impossible, to genuinely compare PPPs against traditional public procurement. And what happens then? Well, it frequently leads to politically motivated decisions rather than truly evidence-based choices about the best way to deliver a service. For example, in Brazil, the consistently low number of bidders in many PPP processes, sometimes as few as 2 serious contenders, severely limits competition. How can you really say that's achieving the best possible VFM for the public in that scenario? It raises serious questions about whether the public sector is genuinely getting value, or if it's simply accepting whatever price the very limited market offers. My core concern here is that the illusion of affordability isn't just a financial sleight of hand, it's a systematic failure to grasp that unless true long-term fiscal liabilities and contingent risks are transparently modeled and accounted for on public balance sheets from day one, PPPs will inevitably, systematically shift burdens onto future taxpayers.
Okay, fair point about the historical challenges, especially the early days, in assessing VFM. I absolutely agree that early methodologies were often imperfect, sometimes significantly so, but I'd frame it differently now. While the complexity of assessing value for money in these very long-term, often complex projects is undeniable, the intent and, crucially, the evolving mechanisms are clearly there now to ensure it. Portugal, for instance, now includes explicit requirements for comparing financial viability against a reference group of efficient public hospitals. They rigorously define and cap the real internal rate of return for shareholders over the contract term. This shows a clear evolution, a move towards more robust and specific financial analysis based on lessons learned. The Brookings report, among others, consistently confirms that when PPPs are carefully evaluated, when the homework is done properly regarding costs and benefits, they are a powerful and useful tool in the public finance toolkit. The learning curve, particularly in countries with less experience, doesn't negate the potential for PPPs to deliver superior value when proper, evolving methodologies for cost and risk are diligently employed. We're moving beyond those early struggles. I truly believe that.
I come at it from a different way, I suppose. Even with these evolving methodologies, the rationalist classification that still applies to VFM assessment in both Brazil and to a degree even in Portugal, particularly when you look closely at risk sharing in the preliminary project analysis phase, still indicates a persistent gap. There's often insufficient detail provided on the comprehensive risk matrices. How risks are actually valued and allocated isn't always clear. And there's inadequate specification of how to transparently handle contingencies when things inevitably go wrong. This critical lack of upfront clarity often leads, in practice, to the public sector implicitly bearing more risk than was initially intended, or certainly more risk than is publicly disclosed at the outset. This fundamental lack of rigorous upfront planning and genuinely transparent risk allocation, which has been highlighted by numerous studies on Latin American PPPs and elsewhere, leads to an excessive number of contractual changes and renegotiations mid-project. It just keeps happening. These subsequent changes often involve substantial additional investments not accounted for in the original contract, systematically eroding the planned VFM and shifting an ever greater financial burden onto the public. This fundamentally challenges the claim of superior value delivery over the long term. It chips away at the very foundation of the VFM argument.
Right, we've explored governance and value, crucial elements, but none of that truly holds together without proper checks and balances. Transparency and accountability, in my view, are not just, aspirational ideals written into policy documents. They are increasingly integral to modern PPP governance. These mechanisms are absolutely crucial to ensure that public funds are utilized responsibly and that citizens, the ultimate beneficiaries, are well informed. Portugal's approach, again, stands out as commendable here. Their UTAP, that specialized central unit we discussed, centralizes and proactively publishes a vast array of information on PPPs. This includes projections of charges, expected revenues, and detailed quarterly performance reports, all available. This level of institutionalized, proactive disclosure significantly enhances both visibility and credibility. It builds trust. Furthermore, their contracts mandate the creation of internal hospital committees focused specifically on ethics, on humanization of care, and on the quality of services, effectively involving frontline staff, doctors, nurses, in critical oversight roles from within. While challenges in external stakeholder engagement certainly exist globally, that's true. The continuous refinement of these internal and public-facing accountability structures demonstrates a strong commitment to democratic values within PPPs. It underlines that true accountability in PPPs moves beyond mere compliance checks. It embeds ethical and quality oversight directly into operational structures and public reporting to ensure genuine alignment with democratic values and public expectations.
That's a compelling argument for how it should work, perhaps. But have you considered that many of these mechanisms, in reality, often fall critically short of genuine transparency and robust accountability? In Brazil, as we've discussed, despite having federal laws on information access, the practical implementation of transparency and accountability in PPPs is still categorized as survival. Again, this means it barely meets minimal legal requirements. It doesn't provide truly interactive or comprehensive information channels for citizens who want to understand what's going on. There's often a notable absence of standardized, easily accessible reporting on actual project performance, the real costs being incurred, and the specific financial impacts on the public budget over time. This opacity, this lack of clear information, allows for the potential manipulation of information. That's a problem noted internationally regarding the, shall we say, convenient concealment of payment adjustments or unexpected contingent liabilities that suddenly appear. Without rigorous, truly independent audit reports and information that is presented in a way that's accessible and easy for the public, for journalists, for civil society groups to understand, both citizens and even official oversight bodies struggle to hold private partners truly accountable. This consistently leads back to that democratic deficit where commercial interests can unfortunately and sometimes easily overshadow the public good. And it's not just Brazil. Numerous studies looking at PPPs across Latin America, and indeed projects in parts of Eastern Europe, echo these transparency shortcomings, suggesting it's a broader systemic challenge, not just isolated incidents. How can the public really know if they're getting a good deal?
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because the legal frameworks, the actual laws on the books in both countries, actually lay a very clear groundwork for transparency and accountability. And the unmistakable trend, if you look over the last decade or so, is towards continuous improvement. Portugal's legislation explicitly details what the UTAP must publish online. It's mandated, demonstrating a commitment to proactive, institutionalized disclosure. Even in Brazil, the emphasis in the legislation itself on transparency as a guiding principle for PPPs points to an underlying recognition of its importance. The key, then, isn't that the model is inherently flawed, but rather to strengthen these frameworks and, crucially, dedicate sufficient resources to their implementation and enforcement. Acknowledging existing limitations in current practice simply highlights areas for further development, for investment, for capacity building, not a fundamental, insurmountable flaw in the PPP model's ability to eventually foster high levels of transparency and accountability through evolving governance structures and, yes, sustain stakeholder pressures. It's a journey, it's ongoing work, not a static failure.
I come at it from a different way. The problem with many PPPs, as I see it,
is that these good governance principles, which sound great on paper, often clash head-on with the messy operational realities of these incredibly long-term, complex contracts. The example I mentioned earlier of Brazil's rationalist classification for its monitoring and control systems, which often rely on a so-called independent verifier who, well, may actually be contracted and paid by the concessionaire itself, raises serious fundamental questions about genuine independence and impartiality. Can you really be independent if the entity you're monitoring is paying your bills? This setup, where oversight is effectively delegated to a third party with clear potential conflicts of interest, further exacerbates the already significant information asymmetry between the public and private sectors. Without truly independent, consistently disclosed audits and performance assessments, the public simply cannot ascertain the real quality of service being delivered or the financial prudence of the partnership over its entire lifespan. This means accountability risks becoming performative rather than substantive. It looks accountable on paper, but is it really? It leaves the public interest critically exposed to ongoing risks and potential exploitation down the road. My argument boils down to this. Without truly independent and consistently disclosed audits, accountability in PPPs risks becoming performative rather than substantive, leaving the public interest exposed to ongoing, unmitigated risks.
Well, our discussion today has truly, I think, illuminated the multifaceted nature of public-private partnerships and their profound capacity, but also, yes, there's sometimes significant challenges in serving the public interest. From my perspective as the advocate, I've aimed to present the case for PPPs as a dynamic and, frankly, an absolutely necessary tool in today's world. They are capable of leveraging private sector efficiencies, innovation, and much-needed capital to deliver critical infrastructure and services. My emphasis has consistently been on the potential, the proven potential in some cases, for robust, adaptive governance frameworks, as powerfully exemplified by Portugal's evolving system to align diverse interests and meticulously ensure genuine value for money.
And I, as the dissenter, have hopefully, thoughtfully, and perhaps powerfully at times, highlighted the inherent vulnerabilities and the practical shortcomings of PPPs, particularly when they're implemented in institutionally weaker context. My arguments focused on the undeniable no free lunch reality, the pervasive risks stemming from information asymmetry, the potential for opportunistic behavior by partners, and the often inadequate transparency and accountability mechanisms that can, and unfortunately sometimes do, compromise the public interest they were meant to serve.
It is abundantly clear, I think we both agree, that both perspectives underscore the extraordinary complexity involved in these partnerships. Whether you view them ultimately as a powerful solution for modern challenges, or perhaps a risky endeavor that demands extreme caution, the successful implementation of PPPs ultimately hinges on achieving a delicate yet absolutely crucial balance. That balance requires robust governance, meticulous value for money assessment from the outset, unwavering transparency throughout the project lifecycle, and genuine independent accountability. The path to optimal public service delivery through PPPs requires ongoing critical evaluation, adaptive governance that learns from mistakes, and an unyielding commitment to the public good above all else. The challenges are undeniably real, but so too is the pressing need for innovative solutions in public service provision globally.
We encourage you, our listeners, to weigh these arguments carefully and form your own conclusions. Thank you for joining us on The Debate. For more insightful debates on critical issues shaping the construction world, infrastructure, and indeed much beyond, remember to subscribe to the Debate channel. We'll see you next time.